you guys for hanging in here. I'm going to be providing the fertility update. In previous years, I've kind of focused in on a couple of experiments that we may be doing. But this year it's going to be a little bit broader. Many of you are very familiar with the increase in input costs, fertilizer certainly being among one of them. So I'm kind of looking back, at least partially, on some of the previous work that we've done, just trying to see ways if and suggest ways that you may be able to cut back on fertilizer inputs this year when costs are so high. So the first thing I'd like to talk about quickly, and this is very old news for, if you've been listening to me for any time, and that's putting on all your fertilizer up front. And what we're meaning is not to plan for a top dress nitrogen fertilizer application. A lot of growers, it's just part of their program is to put it in at usually around PI and go with that. We're suggesting that, well, certainly our research suggests that you can put that top dress into your aqua and you would be good to go. And what we mean with that is you're applying your full seasonal N rate at the start of the season, the aqua and the starter blend. The starter blend, again, just as a reminder, it can be applied pre-flood along with your aqua, or it can be applied up to 30 days after planting if you're concerned about scum buildup, or some growers, if they're putting on an herbicide like Regiment, they're wanting to give a little nitrogen following that, because the thought is that some of these herbicides kind of set the rice back a little bit. We still recommend checking at PI if more N is necessary, and we've talked about these various tools that can be used, green seeker, leaf color charts, to sort of assess the plant at that time, and I'm not going to go into that further. I just want to say why we're making these recommendations. It's based on a lot of research, and this is just some of it, but this is from one of my students, Tella. And what we have here is the total seasonal N rate on the x-axis here. That includes everything you apply pre-plant as well as your top dress. And then we have the yield on this axis here in hundredweights per acre. And the black line is where all of the nitrogen, all of your total N rate for the season goes on pre-plant. And the blue line is where it's split. And the split in this case is applying 30 units of nitrogen at top dress, so that your pre-plant would actually be 30 less than that. So I'm just highlighting none of these results are significant, show significant differences between applying it all pre-plant or split. But I just wanted to highlight there's a couple of the points just to further illustrate some of this. This is Arbuckle. This experiment was done in. And you can see the black line here, all of it pre-plant, and the yields totally are overlap with the where you split that nitrogen. So certainly in this case, one would say that the results, even not statistically, they're identical almost. Up at the experiment station, a similar study, the black line is a little higher, perhaps suggesting if we saw that all the time, that this would mean that it's better to apply everything pre-plant. And then you can go to another sort of the opposite thing where the blue line is a little higher, saying, well, maybe it's better to apply it as a split. Importantly, none of these differences are significant that we see. And so we're making the recommendation just to apply it as pre-plant and then evaluate later. The other thing we did this year is look at other nutrients at the request of the Rice Research Board. We've looked a lot at NP and K, but people are concerned, well, maybe there's other nutrients that are a problem or that we need to be aware of. And so in 2021, last year, we had 28 fields participate. We took soils before it was fertilized and a Y-leaf sample 30 to 40 days after After planting, we took 3 samples per field, and then we got some information from the growers about those fields. We added this to a study where we had 55 fields back in 2 years, 2012 and 2013. So we have over 80 fields that I'm going to be drawing from in this. In this year, in these 2 years, we don't have plant samples. So the real short answer to the results here is we didn't find in all of these soils and plants, we didn't find a single case where the soils or plants showed deficiencies for magnesium, sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, or copper. We did see some soils that were deficient, that showed deficiencies in boron, but we didn't see that in the plant. The plant tissues were all fine. We did see some toxicities related to boron. Just quickly showing a couple of the key nutrients here. Sulfur, there's a lot of decisions. Do I apply sulfur or not? Certainly talking with growers, asking why do you apply ammonium sulfate versus urea, as a top dress maybe. And they say, well, some of it's just insurance in case I'm low on sulfur. Well, in our studies, all of the soils, the critical level is 9 ppm. The lowest that we saw in any of the soils was 24 ppm. This is the soil data down here. You can just see how it's distributed. 9 is way down here, below anything that we saw. The same with a plant critical level. The critical level is 0.6. The lowest we saw was 0.28. If you look on a graph of what the leaf looked like versus the soil, you can see these red lines show the critical value for each of those. You can see that all of the points fall well within what we would consider to be safe. I just looked at regionally where we saw lower sulfur levels, and generally, again, low is less than 30. That's still well above the critical, but generally in the southern part of the valley is where we saw most of the soils which were less than 30. Zinc, very similar story. Critical level is 0.8 ppm. The lowest we saw was around 1. So again, above that. The plant, we didn't see any deficiencies here. Again, the relationship between soil and leaf is down here. You can see that none of the samples that we looked at fell less than those critical values. So again, all sort of within the safe zone. We also saw, we just looked at ones that were lower, less than 2 ppm. And again, we tended to see more of those in the southern part of the valley. We saw high ones up above, ones that were above 8, well above anything critical, more in the northern part of the valley. Boron, a very somewhat similar. We didn't see any problems with the leaf. We did see a few samples here where it was below what they're calling a critical level for boron. But given the fact that all of the leaf tissues were fine, not very concerned with that. If you were concerned, just looking around the valley, it's more up in Butte County where we saw a lot of the lower levels. So if you're looking for boron deficiencies, that might be where you'd start to look, but the data here doesn't suggest you're going to find a lot of it anyways. All right, one of the objectives of this study too was to look at soil potassium and other nutrients in relationship to straw baling. Straw removes a lot of nutrients. We're certainly concerned with potassium. And encouragingly, we found that in the fields where there was a good history of baling, that the soil K values were very similar amongst them. And again, I think the PCAs and certainly cooperative extension has been very vocal about the need to apply to keep up with soil potassium, to apply for extra potassium if you're baling straw. And I think that's been being done as growers are applying more fertilizer. The one thing that showed a bit of concern was soil phosphorus values in fields that had straw baling were lower than the other fields. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. I would say this year is a good year to think about soil testing and then just apply the nutrients if it needs it based on that. We have developed some fairly good recommendations for both phosphorus and potassium to let you know if your soil needs it or not. If you're doing phosphorus, we strongly recommend using the Olsen P or bicarbonate phosphorus test. They're the same test, but they just go by different names. Don't use the Bray test or the Melick. Sometimes these are offered by this. You'll need to probably specifically ask for this test. If it's above 12 ppm, you're unlikely to need fertilizer. Below 6 ppm is you're going to definitely need it. Same for potassium. Above 120, you're going to likely be okay for that. Less than 60, you would need it. So those are some fairly conservative guidelines to go by. Just going back to the phosphorus and the need to maintain it, and then I think in general, not in just the straw bale, where they're baling straw, but I think where most growers are under applying phosphorus. And if you just look at, this is grain yield here in sacks per acre, going from 70 to 110. This is the amount of phosphate removed just from the grain. So the straw, it stays in the field, and this is what's removed in the grain. This is the amount of phosphorus removed when you're removing grain plus half the straw, which is a typical, when you're baling, it's fairly typical to remove about half the straw that's there. And I had mentioned earlier that a lot of growers are applying around 40 units, maybe 45 units of phosphate. Well, you can see that if you're getting 80 sacks an acre, 40 units is basically supporting that level of yield. If you're yielding higher, you're removing, even if your straw stays there, you're removing more of your phosphorus, and over time, and we've seen it, your phosphorus levels in your soil start to go down. So if you're getting 90 sacks, that's the average. Now for California is about 90 sacks an acre. You need to be applying at least 47, maybe 50 units of phosphorus just to maintain your soil phosphorus values. Growers are getting 100 routinely and higher, and you need to be thinking about 50 to 55 units just to maintain those levels. If you're baling, just think about adding an extra 10 units of phosphorus to your to the rate to just kind of maintain those levels. And here I provided some phosphorus deficiency symptoms. The big one early on is dark green leaves that are narrow. And that's a fairly good indicator. You also see reduced tillering and delayed heading when you have low soil phosphorus. So what happens when you can't apply aqua? Aqua is by far the best nitrogen fertilizer to use. Put as much of it in as aqua as you can. It's very efficiently used. It's a cheap source of nitrogen, and we highly recommend using it as much as possible. But sometimes it's not possible. It may not be available. There may be supply issues. That's happened a few times in the last couple of years. Sometimes it rains and your field gets wet and you can't run a tractor over that. So what do you do then? Well, if possible, say a supply chain issue and urea is available, apply that to a dry soil. And when you're applying it to a dry soil, you want to incorporate it if possible, or you can apply it as a liquid. You can inject it like urea. when you do that, your aqua rate is going to be similar to your urea rate. It's used just as efficiently. It's just a more expensive fertilizer. So the rate would stay the same in these. And we have a lot of data kind of backing that up. However, if the soil is wet before you're flooding it, you're going to have to apply that nitrogen after you flood it. It's not good to apply it to a wet soil. And then nitrogen splits is your best option. This is data from last year. This is the yields versus aqua versus urea split or ammonium sulfate split. And you can see that the aqua is the best. Even splitting the same rate doesn't give you the same yield as aqua. So you're going to have to increase that nitrogen rate. And you're going to have, we suggest applying it 3, 4, 5, and 6 weeks after planting at a ratio of 20, 30, 30, 20% of the total N rate at each of those times. So it's an expensive option. It's not a situation you want to end up in. Ammonium sulfate in all cases was the same as urea. This is an area where enhanced efficiency fertilizers, you think that they would work potentially well. We've looked at them quite a bit over the last few years, and there's been a few cases where one of them may have worked better than urea by itself, but in most cases, they're similar to urea or worse. So we do not recommend using those in water-seeded rice systems. There may be a place for them in drill-seeded systems. They're very expensive fertilizers as well. A lot of you guys are going to be looking at rice going into coming out of a fallow last year. It was 100,000 acres fallowed last year. We just wanted to look at the nitrogen management, and we're just starting this work following fallow versus fields where you're growing rice continuously. And what we have here is these are the results of 1 year of study. We're going to continue this, but this last year, what we saw, this is the yield, and this is your different nitrogen rates that we applied across both of those, rice after fallow, and then the continuous rice is the red or orange line down below. So what we saw was that rice after fallow, the yield seems to be a bit higher, and I think most of you would agree that you do have a higher yield potential after a fallow. What kind of surprised me is that the optimal N rate for both rice after fallow and continuous rice was similar. I had really thought that we'd be able to use less nitrogen following fallow, but certainly this data doesn't suggest that, but it does suggest you're getting more yield for the nitrogen you apply, which is good. What we did see, which may explain some of the yield difference between these two systems here, is variation in stem rot severity between continuous and fallow. Continuous had higher stem rot severity than in the fallow. Talking to Luis, this difference in stem rot severity could result in roughly a 3% yield loss, which is kind of along the lines of what we're seeing. So. My final slide really on fertility is dry seeding nitrogen management. It's not very commonly practiced, but it seems like more growers are kind of dipping their foot into at least trying it, seeing how it works. And what we can say is, I mean, it is a good opportunity to change herbicide programs. Certainly Kasim and before him, Albert Fisher have really recommended it as one of the strategies to use, kind of rotating dry seeding, water seeding to address herbicide resistant weeds. The yield potential is similar to water seeding. You're going to see in the yield contest this year that one of the winners came out of a drill seeded field. So the yield potential is similar if you do it right. You really have two options for managing nitrogen in a dry seeded system. One is to apply urea in your starter just before a permanent flood to a dry soil. You're going to need to increase your nitrogen rate in this system probably by about 40 to 50 units of N per acre. You just have a lot of losses associated with applying surface applied fertilizer. You got ammonia volatilization being a biggie, but you also get some denitrification issues as well. If the soil surface is really wet, then you might need to go to a split application, which we had talked about before, which again can be expensive. You can also, and a number of growers have done it. The yield contest winner did it this year. They're applying aqua before planting, just like you would for a water seeded system. But you still need to increase your N rate a little bit by about 20 to 50 pounds of N per acre more. And this is due to increased denitrification losses because you're flooding and drying your field early in the season. And that leads to nitrification followed by denitrification, where the nitrogen is lost as N2 gas. So I think Whitney and Luis have probably talked about the fact sheets we have on this. You can find them on our website. They're available. And with that, I'd like to thank you.